The morning the trouble began was bright enough to make the entire neighborhood look almost unreal, as if everything had been polished, staged, and presented under a perfect daylight gloss. The sun scattered across the rooftops, the trimmed lawns, and the identical driveways that stretched through the community like the ribs of a well-designed beast. From the outside, the neighborhood always appeared peaceful, so peaceful that new homeowners sometimes mistook it for paradise. But beneath that brightness, beneath the carefully manicured hedges and ornamental trees chosen by committee votes, something was always waiting. Something hungry, something territorial. On that morning, the air held a stillness that felt staged. The birds were unusually quiet near the back of the property, where my yard extended further than any of my neighbors, a long, sloping section of unused earth that bordered the thin tree line. The land had been part of the original survey when the house was built decades ago, long before the HOA even existed. It was the reason I bought the property in the first place: the space, the privacy, the potential. It was my corner of quiet in a neighborhood that otherwise had rules about how loud wind chimes were allowed to be. The trouble began with faint noises, slow footsteps crunching on gravel, an engine humming in idle, and the unmistakable snap of a clipboard closing. When I looked out the window facing the backyard, I saw 3 HOA board members walking along my fence line with an air of ownership that immediately unsettled the atmosphere. Their vests gleamed sharply under the sun, their laminated badges bouncing against their chests with every step as if validating their authority with each move. They were pacing slowly, inspecting, pointing at survey flags that I knew had not been there the day before. It became clear that they had arrived early, deliberately early, to measure something they believed was theirs. The backyard that I had maintained, expanded, and cherished for years seemed to have become a target overnight. The clipped gestures of the board members carried a confidence that suggested they were not just observing, they were planning. As the day progressed, their presence crept deeper into the hours. Vehicles began to arrive, white SUVs bearing the HOA's emblem, a temporary office tent, and several men hauling long measuring tapes across the grass, as if mapping a battlefield. Under the bright sun, their equipment flickered like weapons. Lines were drawn in chalk. Poles were hammered into the soft ground. And every action felt like an intrusion, a claim being staked. It wasn't long before I noticed something worse. They were pushing further inward, slowly moving their equipment past the original fence post markers. They had begun measuring my yard as if it were an unclaimed wilderness waiting to be absorbed into the HOA's jurisdiction. The land they approached so casually was not just earth and grass. It was my orchard, my garden bed, the shed I built with my own hands, and the quiet refuge where I spent years creating something meaningful. By midday, the activity reached its peak. With the brightness of the afternoon sun shining directly overhead, their confidence seemed to glow with it. Clipboards flicked open and closed. Long shadows stretched across the grass as teams moved around with surveying instruments. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and turned my peaceful backyard into a construction planning site. As I continued to observe from inside, I sensed that something bigger was at play, something more than misinterpretation or an accidental oversight. Their boldness, their certainty, and their lack of hesitation hinted that the decision had been made days or weeks before. Perhaps at one of their private meetings, where votes were cast and decisions were stamped without the presence of homeowners who weren't part of their inner circle. The brightness of the day did nothing to soften the feeling of violation that settled over the property. It made the intrusion sharper, more jarring. The shadows of the board members moved across the yard with the arrogance of individuals convinced that paperwork, influence, and collective force would overpower any resistance. They behaved like land was something they could simply take, like ownership was just a matter of confidence. As afternoon light shimmered across the fence line, a sheet of paper was pinned to my gate. The gust of warm wind made it flap gently, catching the sunlight like a warning flag. The message contained a declaration, a claim outlining that the HOA believed a substantial portion of my backyard was community property due to a boundary discrepancy. The wording was sterile, but the meaning was unmistakable. They intended to take it. The claim was accompanied by a date, only 7 days away, stating their intention to begin land reclamation and integration. In the HOA's language, this meant they planned to tear down my fencing, remove my structures, and incorporate the land into their master plan for a new community green zone. The realization came slowly and heavily. They weren't just claiming the land. They had already planned what to do with it. The brightness of the day felt blinding at that moment. The sun's glare seemed to harden the edges of everything in view. The trees, the fence, the papers pinned on the gate. The world around me felt overexposed, as if reality itself had become too sharp, too vivid. The HOA had made a move, and they had done it brazenly, casually, and with complete confidence. As the board members packed their gear and headed toward their vehicles, their shadows stretched long behind them, crossing over the parts of my yard they hoped to seize. The rumble of their engines echoed between the neighboring homes as they drove away, leaving behind their markers and stakes like silent soldiers standing guard over their intentions. The backyard felt different, not smaller, but threatened, as if it sensed that something was coming. The land had always been peaceful, but now the stillness carried a weight, a warning of the conflict ahead. When evening approached and the sun began its slow descent, the yard looked unchanged in structure but utterly transformed in atmosphere. The bright day had revealed their intentions, and the fading light seemed to pull a curtain over the first act of the disturbance. The fight for the backyard was no longer a possibility. It had become inevitable. And as that day ended, a decision formed. If they wanted to challenge the boundaries of my land, then I would reinforce those boundaries in ways they never expected. The backyard would not be surrendered. It would be fortified. It would become a fortress. The next morning rose with a brightness that felt almost artificial. The early sunlight blanketed the neighborhood in a golden glow, highlighting everything with such sharp clarity that even the smallest imperfection stood out. Yet despite the peaceful appearance, the tension from the previous day lingered in the air like a silent alarm that refused to switch off. The stillness carried a sense of anticipation, as if the entire environment held its breath for whatever came next. The moment the sun washed over the backyard, the remnants of the HOA's intrusion became impossible to ignore. Survey flags dotted the lawn in tight, intrusive clusters. Stakes with bright-colored ribbons lined a path that carved directly through the center of the yard. Chalk lines scarred the grass in long, deliberate strokes. Every mark they left behind told the same story. They believed the land was no longer mine. The brightness made the markers stand out even more, almost glowing under the daylight. It felt intentional, as if the sun itself had been recruited to highlight the territory they hoped to claim. Yet in that same brightness, the idea that had blossomed in the final moments of the previous day grew even stronger. If they were planning to take the land by force of paperwork and intimidation, then I would reshape it into something impenetrable, something that could not be quietly absorbed into their plans. The first step was understanding exactly what I was up against. The HOA thrived on documentation, loopholes, and the confidence of collective authority. They leaned on the belief that homeowners rarely fought back, especially not with the same level of intensity or preparation. But this time they had targeted the wrong yard. The land behind my house was more than grass and soil. It was personal history, months of work, and years of peace. A sanctuary worth defending. As the sun climbed higher, I began walking the entire perimeter of the property, tracing my fingers along the old fence posts, the garden stones, the borders of the orchard. Every inch had meaning, and each step fueled the determination that solidified inside me. The idea of a fortress was no longer symbolic. It was becoming literal. The vision sharpened with each minute of observation. The yard, illuminated under the vivid morning light, revealed its potential. The slope on the left side provided natural elevation. The large oak near the center offered height and structure. The shed at the rear could become a command point, and the long stretch of open yard was perfect for constructing a barrier that would make any effort of intrusion nearly impossible. Before building anything, I needed documentation. Not the flimsy claims pinned to my gate, but real records, surveys, deeds, plats, and archival maps. The HOA relied on selective knowledge. I would rely on complete knowledge. The brightness of the day made every detail more visible, as if encouraging me to capture everything before they returned with more equipment and more arrogance. With the sun growing warmer, I took measurements of every boundary marker I knew was original. I photographed the old metal stakes buried halfway beneath soil and grass, left behind by the initial builders decades ago. Some were rusted, some bent, but they were still there, still standing as silent witnesses of the true property lines. Their presence alone was enough to counter any claim the HOA attempted to push. For hours, the yard became a map of information gathering. The bright light reflected off measuring tools, casting sharp shadows along the ground that stretched like the bones of the land itself. Each recorded measurement felt like reclaiming a piece of ground they had tried to seize. The process was long, methodical, and necessary. But the brightness of the day didn't just illuminate the yard. It also revealed the early movements of the HOA's next steps. By midday, 2 vehicles slowly passed by the street in front of the house. White SUVs with tinted windows, creeping forward like predators circling their prey. Their slow pace was too controlled to be casual. Although they never stopped, their presence made it clear they were monitoring, observing, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Their behavior only strengthened the resolve forming inside me. The fortress would not simply be a wall or a fence. It would be a transformation of the entire backyard, an architectural assertion of ownership they couldn't ignore, a statement of unwavering resistance. After gathering the necessary measurements, I moved on to the planning stage. The backyard became a drafting site. Under the bright afternoon sun, I laid out boards, markers, tape measures, and layers of graph paper across the porch table. The plans began to take shape. A perimeter structure with reinforced posts, elevated barriers, and layered landscaping designed to make the yard both fortified and visually unquestionable. The brightness of the sun made the pages glow, each line and measurement crisp and exact. The blueprint grew steadily, a double-reinforced boundary wall stretching the entire width of the yard. Elevated planters filled with dense shrubs that served as natural barriers. Structural beams capable of resisting forced removal. Security lighting with motion detection strong enough to illuminate the entire area at night. Strategic placement of cameras to cover every angle. What began as an idea now became a structured, detailed design. The fortress wouldn't look aggressive. It would look intentional, artistic even. But beneath its design, it would be unmovable, something even the HOA couldn't challenge without drawing attention to their own unlawful intentions. While I planned, the day continued in its relentless brightness, casting long sunbeams across the yard. The more I outlined, sketched, and measured, the stronger the transformation became. The land was no longer something that could be quietly claimed. It was becoming a declaration of defiance. The signs of the HOA's restlessness appeared again in the afternoon. A small group of board members walked down the sidewalk, stopping periodically to glance at the backyard. Their expressions carried suspicion, as though they sensed something forming behind the fence, but could not yet understand its purpose. Their uncertainty was a small victory. The planning was working. By late afternoon, the sketches were complete. The fortress had a form, a combination of engineering, landscape architecture, and stubborn resistance. The bright sunlight reflected off the final blueprint like a challenge sent directly to the HOA's authority. But planning was only the beginning. The real work would begin the next day. Construction materials needed to be ordered. Heavy posts, concrete, stone, steel brackets, timber beams, everything required to build something that would stand taller, stronger, and more permanent than anything the HOA had imagined. As the sun began its descent, the brightness softened. The yard, still scattered with the HOA's markers, seemed to anticipate the changes that were coming. It no longer felt violated. It felt on the edge of transformation. By the time evening shadows stretched across the grass, The decision had been made. The HOA had drawn their lines. Now I would draw mine, far thicker, far deeper, and impossible to erase. The fortress would rise. The third morning rose even brighter than the ones before, with sunlight pouring across the backyard in long, shimmering sheets. The grass gleamed as if polished overnight, and the air held a crisp sharpness that carried the scent of determination, though perhaps its sensation existed only in my mind. The yard didn't feel like a simple piece of property anymore. It felt like a battleground waiting for the first move, a place on the brink of transformation. By the time the sun lifted fully above the rooftops, the first shipment of construction materials arrived. A long flatbed truck rolled slowly down the street, its metallic frame flashing under the daylight. The sound of its brakes hissing echoed through the quiet neighborhood, catching the attention of nearly every resident within earshot. Curtains shifted, front doors opened slightly. Neighbors peered from porches, trying to make sense of the unusual activity. The HOA board members were the quickest to react. From across the street, two members stood stiffly on a driveway, their faces tightened by suspicion. Another emerged from her front door with a clipboard already in hand, as if she had been waiting for an excuse to intervene. The brightness of the sun made their narrowed eyes glisten sharply, revealing their irritation before a single formal complaint could be filed. But the materials kept coming: heavy posts, reinforced beams, metal brackets, concrete bags, interlocking stone panels, and rolls of industrial-grade landscaping mesh. Under the sunlight, the stack began to resemble the skeleton of an imposing structure, one that clearly wasn't meant to be temporary. Workers unloaded everything with swift precision, their movements loud and visible enough to unsettle anyone watching. The brightness of the day intensified the spectacle. Every beam reflected the sunlight. The white concrete bags stood out like bold declarations. The metallic tools and equipment glinted under the rays. The backyard transformed from a quiet open space into a developing construction zone, unmistakable and alive with energy. The workers moved efficiently, taking measurements, marking new guidelines, and preparing the ground with tools that hummed and clattered throughout the day. The sound of drills, saws, and shovels cutting into the earth replaced the peaceful ambience that had once defined the neighborhood mornings. And with every passing minute, the HOA's discomfort grew more visible. Across the street, the board members grew restless. Their postures stiffened. They took photos from a distance. They whispered among themselves. Their expressions made it clear they believed the work was a direct affront to their authority. And in truth, it was. The fortress was not only a structure, it was a message. The workers began by installing the first anchor points. Deep holes were dug into the ground, measured carefully, and filled with heavy concrete. Into these foundations, the reinforced posts were set, tall, thick, and unyielding. The bright sunlight made the posts look more imposing than they already were, each one a towering declaration of resistance against the HOA's attempted takeover. As the first row of posts went up, something shifted in the atmosphere of the neighborhood. People who had initially watched with curiosity now sensed the deeper tension. Neighbors drifted closer, some pretending to inspect their mailboxes or adjust plants just to sneak a glance over the fence line. Even the birds seemed to remain unusually quiet, as if aware of the unfolding conflict. By late morning, the HOA made its first move of the day. A board member marched down the sidewalk with rigid steps, scribbling notes, stopping frequently to take pictures. The bright sunlight reflected off her clipboard, giving her movements an almost theatrical quality. Her frustration radiated through every gesture, as if the construction itself was a personal offense. Despite her hovering presence, the construction continued without interruption. Workers set the foundation for a double-layered barrier wall, using thick beams and durable stone that would be nearly impossible to dismantle without heavy machinery. Under the intense daylight, the materials looked sleek and formidable, each piece adding to the fortress's growing presence. As midday approached, the heat intensified. Sunlight bounced off the metallic surfaces and cast long shadows behind the posts and beams. The structure began to take shape, linear, strong, unmistakably intentional. The backyard no longer resembled something fragile or threatened. It began to resemble a stronghold. The installation of the second tier began shortly after. Elevated planters were assembled along the inner perimeter, designed not only for aesthetic appeal, but also for additional reinforcement. Dense shrubbery would eventually fill the planters, forming a natural barrier that complemented the structural one. In the brightness of the day, the new planters shimmered with potential, their surfaces glowing under the sun. The HOA board members' frustration continued to grow. By early afternoon, a small group had congregated beneath the shade of a tree across the street, staring at the construction with arms crossed and expressions that twitched with irritation. The brightness made their discomfort more visible, their silhouettes sharp against the shining pavement. They made several attempts to approach, though each time they hesitated, cautiously observing the workers and the developing structure. Their caution spoke volumes. They didn't yet know what rules they could claim had been broken, nor what violations they could threaten. The uncertainty made them pause, forcing them to observe rather than interfere. But they were clearly planning something. Their whispered huddles, their pointed gestures, and their long stares revealed a building strategy of their own. The brightness of the day made it impossible for them to hide their intentions. Their movements were all too clear. Despite their silent brewing plans, construction continued smoothly. The third row of posts went up, thicker and taller than the previous ones. A reinforced lattice structure connected them, creating the frame for what would become a formidable wall. Workers poured additional concrete around the bases, ensuring the structure would withstand weather, pressure, and any attempted dismantling. By late afternoon, the framework of the fortress stood tall, its shadow stretching across the yard like a protective arm. Sunlight poured through the beams, highlighting every angle, every structural detail, every symbol of resistance. The yard looked transformed, no longer an open, vulnerable space, but a developing stronghold that radiated quiet defiance. Just as the sun reached its peak, a final truck arrived carrying the last shipment of materials: stone panels for the lower fortifications, lighting systems for the perimeter, and steel brackets for reinforcement. The HOA, already agitated, grew visibly alarmed by the new arrival. Their reaction was immediate. One of them hurried down the sidewalk, pacing anxiously, clutching a phone to record the entire delivery. The day remained painfully bright, almost harsh in its clarity. Every movement on both sides, the construction and the HOA's agitation, was exposed under the open sun. The conflict was growing more visible, more undeniable, more inevitable. And yet, the fortress continued to rise. By the time the sun began to drift lower in the sky, the first major phase of construction was complete. A towering barrier had formed along the western edge of the yard, anchored in concrete and reinforced with steel. It stood proud and immovable, casting a bold shadow across the grass. The HOA had wanted the land. Now they faced something far more daunting, an owner unwilling to surrender a single inch. As the final beams were set into place for the day, the neighborhood fell briefly silent. The tension hovered heavy in the bright evening light, settling like dust over everything. The HOA's next move was inevitable, and whatever it would be, the fortress would stand ready. The first rays of morning sunlight stretched across the neighborhood like a calm warning, illuminating the very lines of conflict that had been drawn between me and the HOA. By now, the fortress in my backyard had become impossible for anyone to ignore. The steel-reinforced perimeter, the cameras neatly lined like soldiers on a parade ground, the trench-like garden design, it all stood in silent defiance, forming a barrier that the HOA believed challenged their authority. And although the fortress was entirely within my property lines, the HOA had convinced themselves that it represented something far larger, a threat to their power, their control, and their rule over the neighborhood. But what they didn't realize was that their attempt to force compliance would only expose how unstable and desperate they had become. As the day brightened, I could sense movement gathering near my fence. Vehicles rolled in slowly, sleek SUVs belonging to board members, their polished surfaces reflecting the sunlight. More cars arrived, lining up along the street, as if forming a siege formation. The usual morning peace of the neighborhood was replaced with an uneasy hush, as though even the birds paused their songs to watch what would happen next. I stood inside my backyard fortress, observing through the camera feeds as clusters of HOA representatives examined the fence from every angle, whispering to each other, pointing, scribbling notes, and attempting to project authority despite the tension simmering beneath the surface. Their strategy was clear: overwhelm me with presence, intimidation, and fabricated urgency. But intimidation only works when the target feels cornered, and I was no longer the same homeowner they had pushed around weeks earlier. Now, I had evidence, structure, and preparation on my side, tools they never expected me to use. Throughout the morning, the HOA's behavior became increasingly organized. Clipboard-holding board members paced up and down the sidewalk like inspectors on a mission, trying to identify anything they could use against me. They lingered near the property markers I had highlighted, attempting to argue among themselves about boundaries they clearly didn't understand. They traced their fingers along my newly reinforced fence, hoping to discover a technical violation, an obscure rule, or any angle that could justify legal action. It became obvious that the fortress had rattled them more deeply than I had anticipated, not because of its structure, but because it represented control slipping through their fingers. The more they inspected, the more frantic they appeared. They needed a win, and my fortress was the obstacle standing between them and the illusion of power they desperately wanted to preserve. By midday, a new wave of HOA representatives arrived, carrying folders, measuring equipment, and laminated rule documents that shuffled loudly in the breeze. They formed a semicircle along the sidewalk, analyzing the property as though preparing to launch a full-scale offensive. Neighbors watched from a distance, their curtains cracked, their garage doors partially open, their stances cautious but curious. Some whispered among themselves, while others simply observed with thinly veiled excitement, eager to witness whatever conflict would unfold next. But the HOA had no idea what I had prepared for this moment. Inside my home, my workstation displayed a live feed of every angle of the backyard, recorded in high resolution. Each camera had been calibrated to capture every movement, every footprint, every attempt to trespass, every possible violation of my rights. These cameras weren't just part of the fortress. They were the evidence collectors I'd been waiting to activate, turning the HOA's own tactics against them. I could see the board members pointing at my cameras, frustration tightening their expressions as they realized they were being monitored more closely than ever. The real turning point of the day came shortly after noon, when the HOA president herself arrived, stepping out of a spotless luxury vehicle with an aura of superiority so intense it seemed to command silence. Her appearance was deliberate, perfectly tailored attire, expensive accessories, and a posture that announced her belief in her own power. She surveyed the scene with measured impatience, scanning the fortress with a cold determination that suggested she intended to escalate the conflict far beyond simple complaints and violations. Her arrival triggered a wave of activity among the board members. Papers were exchanged, whispers passed quickly from person to person, and each representative stiffened as she approached. Her presence turned their uncertainty into sharpened ambition, as if they believed they finally had the force necessary to bring down the walls I had built. She moved toward the property line with an air of authority, pointing toward my fortress structure as her board members documented her observations with renewed fervor. They gestured toward the cameras, the reinforced wood, the steel posts deep in the ground, and the security signs I had placed legally and visibly. To them, everything I had constructed symbolized defiance, proof that I was now refusing to bend to their will. They needed to regain control, and they were willing to twist anything to justify their next move. But what they didn't realize was that their attempt to appear organized betrayed the chaos simmering beneath their calm expressions. I monitored their every move, watching as the HOA president scanned the yard, then the house, then the cameras pointed toward her. She understood she was being observed, and the slight shift in her stance revealed a flicker of discomfort, an unfamiliar sensation for someone used to having unquestioned authority. The tension reached its peak when the HOA president instructed two board members to measure portions of the fence directly. Their measuring tapes extended across the grass, their movements abrupt and hurried, their expressions irritated by the realization that every measurement aligned perfectly with property boundaries. It was clear they had hoped to uncover a discrepancy, any discrepancy. Instead, they found precision, compliance, and undeniable proof of my rights. Their frustration grew with each failed attempt to find a violation. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, while the HOA president's expression darkened with slow-burning resentment. The fortress stood unshaken, untouched, and unchallengeable. Every structure, every angle, every detail had been planned with exact legal compliance, leaving them with no leverage. And that was when she made her next move. Unable to find a rule I had broken, the HOA president signaled to her team, who quickly retrieved a bright binder filled with pages of amendments, proposals, and emergency resolutions. They formed a tight circle, reviewing the contents with hushed intensity. They weren't looking for existing rules anymore. They were preparing to create new ones. Their strategy was becoming painfully clear. If they couldn't defeat me with the rules they already had, they intended to rewrite the rulebook entirely. The sight of them drafting new documents at the edge of my property line confirmed one chilling truth. The HOA wasn't retreating. They were escalating. My fortress had forced them into a corner, and they were ready to fight back with everything at their disposal. And although the sunlight still washed the neighborhood in brightness, there was a tension beneath it that hinted at the storm building quietly behind their confident expressions. The morning light spilled across the neighborhood with deceptive gentleness, bright and warm, as though nothing unusual were unfolding behind the rows of identical homes. But beneath that brightness, beneath the calm hum of suburban morning routines, the real battle was quietly taking shape. My fortress, once a defensive measure, was now becoming something far more significant. It was turning into a symbol, a stand, a challenge that the HOA never expected, and one they were growing increasingly desperate to dismantle. By the time the sun fully rose, the HOA's emergency amendments had already been printed, copied, and distributed. Bright white envelopes with bold red "Urgent" labels appeared on every doorstep like warnings dropped from the sky. Residents peeked out of cracked doors to retrieve the papers, their cautious expressions revealing how deep the tension had settled into the bones of the neighborhood. And while many pretended to be uninterested, everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting. Inside my home, the fortress camera feeds displayed a steady stream of movement. HOA board members walked from house to house, gathering signatures, urging residents to support their sudden and necessary rule expansions. New regulations were being proposed with suspicious speed. Restrictions on backyard structures, limits on fence material, requirements for open views, and vague clauses about neighborhood aesthetics. Each rule was crafted with a single purpose: to target my fortress without naming it directly. The HOA believed that if they changed the rules, they could force me to tear everything down. But what they didn't know was that I had prepared for exactly this scenario. As the day brightened further, I moved through my house with calm determination, gathering documents, prints, survey maps, and archived HOA records I had collected over the past few weeks. Each piece of evidence, each notarized confirmation of my property rights, each time-stamped photograph of the original boundary markers, all of it had been assembled meticulously for the right moment. And now, that moment was drawing near. The HOA had convinced themselves they were closing in, tightening the net around me with their rushed legal adjustments. But in truth, they had only revealed their desperation. Their sudden push for emergency regulations exposed how weak their case truly was. And while they attempted to flex their authority, they continued to underestimate just how prepared I had become. Outside, the HOA president positioned herself near my property line once again, clipboard in hand, eyes fixed on the fortress, as if staring down an adversary in broad daylight. Board members congregated around her in small, tense clusters, reviewing signatures and whispering about next steps. Their suspense wasn't hidden anymore. It radiated from them like heat rising from pavement. They wanted the neighborhood to believe they were in control, but their hurried movements and stiff expressions betrayed something else entirely. Fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of weakness. Fear of the fortress standing tall as proof that someone had finally pushed back. The sun climbed higher, warming the wooden beams of my structure, illuminating every reinforced bolt, every layer of careful design. The brightness made the fortress look almost majestic, less like a barrier and more like a declaration. Neighbors passing by slowed down, observing the situation with cautious curiosity. Some admired the construction, some frowned in confusion, and others watched with the same thrill as spectators at a brewing spectacle. A few residents lingered longer than the rest, standing across the street, reading the new emergency rules, and comparing them to images of my backyard they had likely seen circulating through community message threads. Some exchanged glances over the papers, their skepticism clear. They began to recognize the absurdity of rules being rewritten overnight just to target one person. And although they remained silent, I could sense their hesitation, an undercurrent of doubt that the HOA had not anticipated. By midday, the HOA announced a mandatory special meeting scheduled to take place that afternoon in the community park. It was a thinly veiled attempt to rush through their new rule package before anyone could challenge it. They were hoping to corner the residents into compliance and present the amendments as a unified decision. The bright daylight made their urgency stand out even more starkly. Nothing about their behavior looked planned anymore. Everything looked reactionary. I spent the early afternoon preparing my counterstrike. With the sun shining directly into the backyard, I double-checked every camera angle, documenting the HOA's presence as they continued to monitor the fortress like patrols around a contested border. I printed backup copies of every piece of evidence, placing them neatly into folders organized by timeline, topic, and legality. The fortress itself cast long, crisp shadows across the grass, as though guarding the documents inside the house. When the time for the meeting approached, residents began gathering at the park. The atmosphere was bright but tense, a strange contrast that made every movement feel heavier. Children played at a distance, unaware of the conflict happening around them, while adults formed tight circles of hushed conversation. Some carried the new rule packets, flipping through pages with narrowed eyes. Others simply waited, arms crossed, watching the HOA board assemble under the shade of the pavilion. The HOA president scanned the crowd with a controlled smile, but even from across the park, it was clear her composure was beginning to crack. She stood rigidly, holding her clipboard like a shield, knowing that the support she expected might not arrive so easily. I arrived quietly, the fortress standing watch behind me like an imposing sentinel. Residents turned as I approached, their curiosity shifting into focused attention. For many, this was the first time they had seen me since the conflict began, and their expressions carried the silent question they all shared. What would I do now? The HOA board launched into their presentation, discussing urgent threats to neighborhood visual harmony and structural disruptions that may impact community value. Their statements were vague, exaggerated, and clearly crafted to paint the fortress as a community hazard without ever naming it directly. But as they spoke, I could see the residents growing uneasy. The daylight illuminated every page they referenced, making their inconsistencies impossible to hide. And when they finished, expecting applause, the silence that followed struck harder than any argument I could have voiced. That was when I stepped forward, not with anger, not with defiance, but with facts. I presented the original property surveys, the recorded footage of HOA trespasses, the certified documents proving the exact boundaries of my land, and the timestamp showing the fortress had been built legally long before any emergency rules were drafted. I laid out their own rule book, showing how they were violating their own bylaws by attempting to implement retroactive restrictions. I outlined the pattern of harassment, the rushed amendments, the targeted enforcement. And although I didn't need words in this narration, the effect was unmistakable. The residents saw the truth. The meeting ended in chaos. Residents demanding explanations, board members scattering into frantic side conversations, the president retreating behind a mask of strained composure. And as the crowd dispersed, uncertainty settled over the neighborhood like a shifting tide. The HOA had failed to secure their swift victory, but they were far from finished. And the final confrontation, the one that would decide everything, was coming faster than any of us expected. The HOA board faltered. The president stiffened, gripping her clipboard so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her carefully constructed confidence wavered beneath the weight of daylight and public scrutiny. The brightness left no shadows for her intentions to hide in. The sun rose over the neighborhood with an unusual sharpness, its brightness cutting through the still air like a spotlight aimed directly at the simmering conflict that had reached its breaking point. The day felt heavier, brighter, and more expectant than any before it. Every rooftop glimmered beneath the sunlight. Every driveway seemed unnaturally still, and every passing shadow hinted that something was about to shift. It was the kind of morning where even the breeze felt aware of the confrontation stirring within the community. The HOA president and her board had retreated the previous evening in a haze of confusion and frustration, but the silence that followed didn't last long. By sunrise, movement had resumed, subtle at first, then unmistakably coordinated. Cars arrived in a slow but steady stream, board members stepping out with stiff posture and resolute expressions, each carrying binders thick with documents that had clearly been reworked overnight. Their rushed determination gave away their desperation, and though they moved with rehearsed confidence, their attempts to reclaim authority seemed forced and fragile. The HOA believed they were preparing to launch a final offensive, a last attempt to crush the fortress, crush my resistance, and crush the evidence that revealed their misconduct. But the sunlight revealed everything. Their efforts no longer looked like leadership. They looked like panic. From inside my home, the fortress cameras captured every detail. The board members gathering near the sidewalk, the president flipping through tightly stapled packets, the hurried whispers, the obvious tension radiating beneath their attempts at professionalism. The brightness of the morning exposed the cracks in their organization, casting a harsh clarity on the faces of those who were used to ruling from the shadows. The residents began to emerge as well. They moved with caution, stepping out onto porches and lawns, holding coffee cups, morning papers, and the emergency rule packets from the day before. But their expressions had changed. The confusion that once clouded their faces had shifted into something more focused, something sharper. Suspicion, concern, realization. The events of the previous day had cracked the narrative the HOA relied on, and now the truth was beginning to seep through. By mid-morning, a crowd gathered at the edge of my property, residents, HOA board members, and curious observers from neighboring streets. The sunlight reflected off the fortress walls, illuminating the steel reinforcements and the precision of the construction. What the HOA intended to portray as an eyesore now stood like a monument, solid, symmetrical, and undeniably lawful. Its presence anchored the entire neighborhood, pulling every gaze toward the epicenter of the battle. The HOA president stepped forward, positioning herself with exaggerated confidence, attempting to reassert control with sheer posture alone. She brandished the new packet of regulations, holding it as if it were a weapon, prepared to announce sweeping changes she believed would force me to surrender. But even from a distance, it was clear that her authority was slipping through her fingers. Her stance was rigid, her jaw tight, and the overly bright sunlight exposed the strain around her eyes. She signaled to the board, who formed a semicircle behind her like a last-stand formation. They opened their binders, preparing to recite the new regulations they had assembled in frantic midnight meetings. Yet the residents watching from the sidelines no longer looked convinced. Some folded their arms skeptically, others whispered among themselves, and a few stood with expressions that suggested they were waiting for the HOA to overstep just one more time. It did not have to wait long. The HOA president began enforcing her newly crafted rules with aggressive certainty. She demanded immediate modifications, issued threats of escalating fines, and attempted to order the demolition of the fortress under the claim of emergency community protection. The board members moved around with their clipboards and measuring tapes, as if reenacting a scene they had rehearsed too many times in their own heads. But every attempt they made faltered under the weight of the evidence I had already filed. Earlier that morning, before the HOA even arrived, I had submitted a formal complaint to the county, complete with the footage, surveys, timestamps, and documented attempts at retroactive enforcement. The county officials had acknowledged the receipt almost instantly, more quickly than I had expected, and the timing of their response was about to reshape the entire neighborhood. As the HOA president prepared to declare the fortress an unlawful structure, 2 county vehicles rolled into the community, their arrival slicing through the tension like a blade. The sunlight glinted off their windshields as they stopped near the edge of the crowd. Officials stepped out, their expressions calm and observant, carrying thick folders of their own, folders I knew contained everything I had submitted. The residents shifted, turning their attention toward the unexpected arrival with a mixture of curiosity and quiet anticipation. The HOA president froze mid-motion, her confidence visibly draining. She had not expected outside scrutiny. She had not expected oversight. She had certainly not expected accountability. The county officials approached the cluster of HOA board members, requesting their documentation and reviewing it with steady, professional thoroughness. Their measured pace contrasted the frantic energy radiating from the HOA. Sunlight spilled over their open folders, illuminating discrepancies, highlighting inconsistencies, and exposing the rushed, sloppily assembled amendments. The more they examined, the more the tension among the board members intensified. Residents edged closer, drawn by the unfolding shift in power. The county's findings were swift. The emergency rules had been implemented without proper process. The HOA had attempted to retroactively enforce regulations, a direct violation of county law. Evidence of targeted harassment was undeniable, and the recorded trespasses captured on my cameras showed clear boundary violations by board members who had no legal right to cross onto my property. The HOA president's veneer of authority shattered under the weight of each confirmed infraction. The brightness of the day made every detail more visible, every misstep impossible to hide. And as the officials continued their questioning, the board members faltered, unable to defend the shortcomings of their rush strategy. By early afternoon, the county issued a temporary suspension of the HOA's enforcement powers pending a full investigation. Fines were issued, not to me, but to the board members individually for violations of homeowner privacy and unlawful attempts at enforcement. The HOA president received the most severe consequences, her actions cataloged with meticulous detail, each one supported by the evidence I had gathered. The residents watched it all unfold, and the shift in their expressions was unmistakable. Relief, vindication, and a quiet, gathering support for the stand I had taken. The fortress, once controversial, now represented something bigger than my backyard. It had become the structure that exposed corruption and restored balance to a community that had been controlled through fear and manipulation. As the county officials left and the crowd slowly dispersed, the fortress stood tall beneath the bright daylight, no longer a symbol of conflict, but a monument of resilience. The HOA board members retreated with lowered heads, their power crumbling beneath them like sand slipping through open fingers. Their final attempt had failed, and the consequences of their actions were only beginning. Over the next few weeks, the investigation deepened. Several board members resigned to avoid further scrutiny. A new election was scheduled. Residents came forward with complaints they had been too afraid to voice before. The hold the HOA once had over the community unraveled thread by thread, until it became clear that their era of unchecked authority was coming to an end. And through it all, the fortress remained untouched, fully legal, fully protected, and fully mine. What began as a desperate attempt to claim my backyard ended as the unraveling of an entire system built on intimidation. The HOA had pushed too far, underestimated the quiet strength of preparation, and failed to understand that sometimes all it takes is one fortified stand to expose everything. On the final bright morning of the investigation, with sunlight washing across the neatly trimmed lawns, the fortress cast a long, steady shadow that stretched across the yard like a reminder of the battle that had been fought and won. The HOA tried to claim my backyard. Instead, they lost the entire neighborhood. If you enjoyed this story and want more dramatic real-life HOA battles and property showdowns, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for the next unbelievable episode.